In March of 1953, Joseph Stalin, the man who held the Soviet Union in a relentless grip for nearly 3 decades, lay dying in his private residence. Around him, silence. Not a single child stood at his side. For the man who shaped the course of a superpower through fear, violence, and absolute control, the end came not in glory, but in isolation. Stalin's name is etched into history as a symbol of tyranny, yet far less is known about the personal aftermath of his reign, especially for those closest to him by blood. What happens to the children of a dictator? Do they inherit power or shame? Are they protected by their father's legacy or condemned by it? Today, we explore the hidden lives of Stalin's children, the pressures they endured, the choices they made, and the impossible burden of living in the shadow of one of the 20th century's most ruthless figures. Before we explore the individual tragedies of Stalin's children, we need to understand the man who shaped their destinies. Joseph Stalin wasn't born a monster. He was forged into one through years of revolutionary violence and an insatiable hunger for power. By the time he had children, paranoia had already consumed his soul, and he viewed everyone, including his own offspring, as potential threats. Stalin's first wife, Kato Svanitsa, died of typhus in 1907, leaving behind their infant son, Yakov. Those who knew Stalin before and after her death said that whatever humanity remained in him died with her. The revolutionary who had once written love poetry became cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. His second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, was 17 years his junior when they married in 1919. She would bear him 2 more children, Vasily in 1921 and Svetlana in 1926, before her own tragic end in 3/8/1932. Nadezhda was an idealistic Bolshevik who believed in the revolution's promise of equality and justice, but she gradually became horrified by what her husband was doing to achieve his vision of socialism. The household that Stalin created was a toxic environment where love was weaponized and trust was impossible. Stalin would use his children's affection against them, rewarding loyalty with privileges and punishing independence with cruelty. He had also fathered another child, Konstantin Kuzakov, during his exile in Siberia, but this son remained hidden from public view, perhaps saving his life. What makes Stalin's treatment of his children so particularly disturbing is how methodical it was. This wasn't the random cruelty of an unstable mind, but the calculated manipulation of a master politician who understood that controlling his family was essential to controlling his image. Stalin turned his home into a laboratory for the techniques of domination that he would later use on an entire nation. The children grew up surrounded by luxury that was unimaginable for ordinary Soviet citizens, but they paid for their privileges with their freedom, their sanity, and ultimately their lives. They lived in palaces that were also prisons, protected by guards who were also their jailers. Stalin's approach to fatherhood was fundamentally transactional. He would shower his children with attention and gifts when they served his purposes, then withdraw his love the moment they became inconvenient or showed signs of independence. This cycle of manipulation created deep psychological wounds that would plague his children for their entire lives. The irony is staggering. The man who claimed to be creating a worker's paradise couldn't create peace in his own home. The leader who promised to liberate humanity systematically destroyed the people who should have been closest to him. This wasn't just hypocrisy. It was a preview of the larger tragedy that Stalin would inflict on the Soviet Union. Yakov Djugashvili was Stalin's firstborn, and perhaps the most tragic of all his children. Born in 1907 to Stalin's beloved first wife, Kato, Yakov's life was marked by abandonment from the very beginning. When Kato died, Stalin essentially abandoned the infant to be raised by relatives in Georgia, while he pursued his revolutionary career. For the first 14 years of his life, Yakov barely knew his father. Stalin was either in prison, in exile, or consumed with party politics. The boy was shuffled between relatives, growing up with stories about his famous father but having no real relationship with him. When they finally reunited in 1921, the damage was irreversible. Yakov spoke only Georgian, while Stalin had become thoroughly Russified. They were strangers, sharing only blood and a name. The relationship between father and son was poisoned from the start. Stalin viewed Yakov as weak, emotional, and unsuitable for the harsh world he was creating. Yakov was sensitive, artistic, and thoughtful, qualities that Stalin saw as dangerous weaknesses in the brutal environment of Soviet politics. The teenager desperately wanted his father's approval, but every attempt to connect was met with cold rejection. Stalin would humiliate Yakov in front of guests, mocking his Georgian accent, his gentle nature, and his inability to match his father's iron will. The boy tried everything to please Stalin. He studied harder, tried to become more aggressive, even attempted to change his appearance to look more Russian. Nothing worked. Stalin seemed to take pleasure in his son's pain, as if Yakov's suffering proved some point about strength and weakness. The breaking point came in 1928 when Yakov, overwhelmed by his father's constant rejection and unable to bear the pressure of being Stalin's disappointing son, attempted to take his own life with a gun. He survived, but Stalin's reaction was characteristically cold and brutal. Instead of showing concern for his son's mental state or examining his own role in driving Yakov to desperation, Stalin mocked him publicly. Stalin told associates that Yakov couldn't even end his own life properly, suggesting that this failure was just another example of his son's fundamental weakness. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a complete abdication of paternal responsibility. Any normal father would have been horrified by his child's desperate act and would have sought to understand and address the underlying pain. Stalin saw only an opportunity to demonstrate his own superiority. This attempted self-harm wasn't just a cry for help. It was the desperate act of a young man who had been psychologically destroyed by his own father. Yakov had tried everything to win Stalin's love. He studied hard, joined the party, even changed his appearance to look more Russian. The attempt on his own life was his final admission that nothing he could do would ever be enough. But Stalin's cruelty toward Yakov was just beginning. In the 1930s, as Stalin's purges intensified, Yakov watched in horror as his friends and family members disappeared into the night. His own wife's family was arrested and executed on trumped-up charges. The message was clear: proximity to Stalin meant death, even for his son. Yakov began to understand that his father wasn't just cruel to him personally, he was a monster who destroyed everything he touched. When news reached Moscow that Yakov had been captured, Stalin's response shocked even his closest associates. Instead of launching rescue operations or prisoner exchanges, as he had done for other high-ranking officials, Stalin publicly disowned his son. But the betrayal went deeper than anyone initially understood. Stalin declared that there were no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors. He specifically stated that any Soviet soldier who allowed himself to be captured was a traitor to the motherland. This wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a death sentence for his own son. Stalin was essentially condemning Yakov to death while the entire world watched. The psychological cruelty of this decision cannot be overstated. Stalin knew that his public statements would reach German ears and that they would use his words to torment Yakov. He knew that his son would hear his father calling him a traitor while languishing in captivity. Yet Stalin proceeded anyway, prioritizing his political image over his son's life and sanity. The Germans, recognizing the propaganda value of their prize captive, initially treated Yakov reasonably well. They hoped to use him for psychological warfare against Stalin and the Soviet Union. German propaganda broadcasts would feature references to Stalin's son being in their custody, often coupled with criticism of Stalin's abandonment of his own flesh and blood. But Stalin's cruelty reached its peak when the Germans offered to exchange Yakov for Friedrich Paulus, the German field marshal captured at Stalingrad. This was an extraordinary offer. The Germans were willing to trade their highest-ranking prisoner for Stalin's son, recognizing the symbolic and psychological value of such an exchange. Stalin's response was brutal in its simplicity. He refused. He told his negotiators that he would not trade a field marshal for a mere lieutenant, even if that lieutenant was his son. But this explanation was just a cover for a darker truth. Stalin privately admitted to associates that accepting the exchange would make him appear weak, prioritizing family over state. The reality was even more cynical. Stalin calculated that refusing the exchange would actually strengthen his position domestically and internationally. It would demonstrate his unwavering commitment to the Soviet cause and his willingness to sacrifice everything, even family, for the greater good. Yakov's suffering became a tool of Stalin's propaganda machine. Soviet citizens were told that their leader was so dedicated to their cause that he wouldn't even save his own son if it meant betraying state interests. This was presented as evidence of Stalin's moral superiority and his total commitment to the Soviet people. The propaganda machine turned a father's betrayal of his son into a heroic example of leadership. For 3 years, Yakov remained in German captivity, held in various prisoner-of-war camps. Despite reasonable treatment initially, his situation deteriorated as the war progressed and his propaganda value diminished. The Germans became frustrated with his refusal to cooperate with their psychological warfare efforts. Yakov maintained his dignity despite his father's abandonment. He refused to make propaganda statements against the Soviet Union or to criticize Stalin publicly, even though he knew his father had essentially condemned him to death. This loyalty in the face of betrayal makes Stalin's treatment of him even more tragic. The psychological torture Yakov endured during this period was unimaginable. He knew his father had abandoned him, knew that he was considered a traitor by the country he had fought to defend. He received letters from family members who had been forced to denounce him publicly. Yet he also knew that any cooperation with the Germans would justify his father's betrayal and dishonor his mother's memory. If Yakov's story was one of abandonment, then Vasily's was one of corruption and destruction. Born in 1921 to Stalin's second wife Nadezhda, Vasily grew up in the heart of Soviet power, witnessing firsthand the machinery of terror that his father had created. But unlike his older brother, Vasily was initially embraced by Stalin, groomed for greatness, and showered with the privileges of power. This preferential treatment would prove to be Vasily's undoing, because Stalin's love was even more dangerous than his hatred. From childhood, Vasily was surrounded by luxury that was unimaginable for ordinary Soviet citizens. He lived in palatial homes, had access to Western goods that were forbidden to everyone else, and was attended by servants who catered to his every whim. But more importantly, he had his father's attention and approval, at least initially. Stalin saw potential in his second son that he had never seen in Yakov. Vasily was charismatic, physically strong, and seemingly untroubled by the moral complexities that had tormented his older brother. He appeared to possess the ruthless qualities that Stalin valued, and for a time, it seemed that Stalin had found his heir. Vasily's childhood was spent watching his father wield absolute power over the Soviet Union. He attended state functions, met foreign dignitaries, and saw firsthand how fear and violence could be used to control millions of people. Instead of being horrified by this, as Yakov had been, Vasily seemed fascinated by it. Stalin encouraged Vasily's interest in aviation, seeing it as an appropriately masculine and modern pursuit for a future leader. By the age of 19, Vasily was already a pilot in the Soviet Air Force, and his rise through the ranks was meteoric. His natural talent as a pilot, combined with his father's influence and his own aggressive personality, made him a standout figure in military circles. During World War II, Vasily served with distinction as a fighter pilot and squadron commander. He flew dozens of combat missions, shot down enemy aircraft, and earned genuine respect from his peers for his courage under fire. By the end of the war, he had achieved the rank of colonel and commanded significant authority within the Soviet Air Force. For a brief period, it seemed that Vasily might actually live up to his father's expectations. He was a war hero, a skilled pilot, and a charismatic leader who inspired loyalty in his subordinates. Stalin was genuinely proud of his son's achievements and began to envision Vasily playing a major role in the post-war Soviet Union. But success bred arrogance, and arrogance bred recklessness. Vasily began to believe that his father's protection made him untouchable, that his position as Stalin's son placed him above the law and beyond consequences. This belief would prove to be fatally wrong. The warning signs appeared in the late 1940s, when Vasily's behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. He started drinking heavily, not just socially but compulsively, using alcohol to cope with pressures that he couldn't articulate or understand. His flying became reckless, endangering himself and others. His treatment of subordinates became brutal, reflecting the casual cruelty he had learned at his father's knee. More troubling was Vasily's growing involvement in corruption and abuse of power. He used his position to obtain luxury goods, through extravagant parties using state resources, and began to surround himself with sycophants and criminals who fed his ego while exploiting his protection. Stalin, who had initially been proud of his son's military achievements, began to see Vasily as a liability. The preferential treatment stopped, replaced by cold disapproval and eventually outright hostility. But the damage was already done. Vasily had been raised to believe that power was his birthright, and he couldn't understand why his father was suddenly withdrawing his support. Nadezhda Alliluyeva's death in November 1932 sent shockwaves through the Stalin household that would reverberate for decades. Officially, she died of illness, but everyone close to the family knew the truth. She had taken her own life, driven to desperation by her husband's cruelty and the horrors she witnessed around her. Vasily was only 11 years old when his mother died, old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, but too young to comprehend the full implications. What he did understand was that his father was somehow responsible, and this knowledge poisoned their relationship forever. Nadezhda's final act wasn't just personal despair, it was a direct indictment of Stalin's character. She had left behind a letter detailing her husband's cruelties and her inability to continue living with the knowledge of what he was doing to their country. Stalin destroyed the letter, but the damage was done. For Vasily, his mother's death became a source of lifelong guilt and rage. He blamed himself for not protecting her, blamed his father for driving her to desperation, and blamed the system that had made such tragedy inevitable. This guilt manifested in increasingly self-destructive behavior. As Vasily grew older, his drinking became legendary even by Soviet standards. He would disappear for days at a time, engaging in drunken rages that terrified his subordinates and embarrassed his father. But the alcohol wasn't just escapism. It was Vasily's way of numbing the pain of knowing that his family was built on blood and lies. Stalin watched his son's deterioration with growing disgust. The man who had once been proud of Vasily's achievements now saw only weakness and failure. Their relationship became a cycle of reconciliation and rejection, with Stalin alternately trying to reform his son and then giving up in frustration. By the early 1950s, Vasily had become a public embarrassment. His alcoholism was common knowledge within party circles, and his erratic behavior was undermining Stalin's carefully cultivated image of control and competence. The final break came when Vasily, in a drunken rage, publicly criticized his father's policies and accused him of being responsible for his mother's death. For Stalin, this was the ultimate betrayal, not just political opposition, but personal humiliation from his own son. Of all Stalin's children, Svetlana Alliluyeva seemed to have the best chance at a normal life. Born in 1926, she was Stalin's only daughter and initially the apple of his eye. Stalin called her his little sparrow and showered her with affection that he denied his sons. But even Stalin's love was poisonous, and Svetlana would learn that being the favorite child of a dictator was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. From early childhood, Svetlana was kept under constant surveillance disguised as protection. Her every move was monitored by bodyguards who reported back to Stalin. Her conversations were recorded, and her friendships were carefully vetted. She couldn't make a friend, read a book, or express an opinion without Stalin's knowledge and implicit approval. The illusion of normalcy was carefully maintained. Svetlana attended regular schools, participated in youth organizations, and was encouraged to pursue her interests in literature and languages. But beneath this facade of ordinary childhood lay the reality of absolute control. Stalin used his daughter's love and trust as tools of manipulation, rewarding compliance with affection and punishing independence with withdrawal of his attention. As Svetlana grew into adolescence, Stalin's control became increasingly suffocating and possessive. He monitored her correspondence, interrogated her teachers about her behavior, and made it clear that her primary purpose was to serve as a symbol of his paternal side for propaganda purposes. Soviet media regularly featured stories about Stalin the loving father, using Svetlana's apparent happiness as evidence of his human side. But Svetlana was beginning to understand the true nature of her situation. She watched as her half-brother Yakov was abandoned to die in captivity, witnessed Vasily's destruction through alcoholism, and gradually realized that her father's love came with a terrible price: complete submission to his will. The first major conflict came in 1942 when 16-year-old Svetlana fell in love with Alexei Kapler, a Jewish filmmaker and writer who was 40 years old. The relationship was innocent by most standards. They talked about literature, attended films together, and shared intellectual conversations that Svetlana had never experienced before. But Stalin was furious about the relationship for multiple reasons. Kapler was Jewish, and despite publicly condemning anti-Semitism, Stalin harbored deep prejudices against Jews. More importantly, Kapler was an intellectual who encouraged Svetlana to think independently and question the world around her, exactly the kind of influence Stalin wanted to eliminate from his daughter's life. Stalin's response was characteristically extreme and brutal. He had Kapler arrested on trumped-up charges of espionage and sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag. When Svetlana protested and demanded to know why her friend had been imprisoned, Stalin made it brutally clear that anyone she cared about could suffer the same fate. This wasn't just punishment. It was a carefully calculated lesson in absolute control. Stalin was teaching his daughter that her love was dangerous to those who received it, that caring about someone was tantamount to signing their death warrant. The message was unmistakable. If you want to protect the people you love, don't love anyone but me. The psychological impact of this revelation on Svetlana was devastating. She realized that her father had turned her into a weapon against anyone who might influence her or win her affection. Her love had become toxic, her friendship had become deadly, and her very existence as Stalin's daughter made her a danger to anyone who got too close. Svetlana's second major relationship was even more controlled and calculating. Her marriage to Yuri Zhdanov in 1949 was arranged by Stalin for purely political purposes. Zhdanov was the son of Andrei Zhdanov, one of Stalin's closest associates and potential successors. The union was a merger of political dynasties rather than a love match, designed to strengthen Stalin's position within the party hierarchy. The marriage was unhappy from the start, and Svetlana knew that even this relationship existed only at her father's sufferance. She had been given in marriage like a piece of property, her personal desires completely irrelevant to the political calculations involved. When the marriage produced children, even they became tools in Stalin's hands, grandchildren who could be used to ensure Svetlana's continued compliance. But Svetlana's real tragedy wasn't just personal. It was intellectual and spiritual. She was a gifted writer and thinker with a natural curiosity about the world beyond the Soviet Union. She spoke multiple languages, read voraciously, and possessed an analytical mind that could have made significant contributions to literature or scholarship. Instead, her talents were constantly suppressed and redirected to serve her father's purposes. She was forced to write propaganda pieces praising Stalin's achievements while being denied the opportunity to pursue her own creative interests. Her intelligence was seen as a threat rather than an asset, something to be controlled rather than cultivated. As she reached full adulthood, Svetlana began to understand the full scope of her father's crimes. Living at the center of Soviet power, she witnessed the purges, saw the fear in people's eyes when they interacted with her, and gradually realized that her privileged position was built on the suffering of millions of innocent people. By the early 1950s, Stalin's relationship with his surviving children had deteriorated beyond repair. Vasily had become a chronic alcoholic whose behavior embarrassed the regime and threatened Stalin's carefully maintained image of control. Svetlana was increasingly distant and rebellious, questioning the system that had given her so much privilege while destroying so many lives. Stalin himself was becoming increasingly paranoid and isolated, seeing enemies everywhere, including within his own family. The man who had once prided himself on his political cunning was now suspecting that even his children might be plotting against him, despite having no evidence to support these fears. The atmosphere in the Stalin household during this period was toxic beyond description. Family dinners became interrogation sessions where Stalin would quiz his children about their activities, associations, and private thoughts. Any sign of independence or dissent was met with threats, punishment, or the withdrawal of privileges that had been taken for granted. Vasily's alcoholism reached new depths during this period, becoming so severe that he was frequently found unconscious in his apartment, surrounded by empty bottles and the wreckage of what had once been a promising military career. Stalin watched his son's self-destruction with a mixture of disgust and calculation, systematically stripping away Vasily's rank, responsibilities, and access to resources. The relationship between father and son had devolved into a cycle of recrimination and abuse. Stalin would summon Vasily for brutal confrontations, where he would berate his son for his failures, compare him unfavorably to other military officers, and threaten him with imprisonment or worse. Vasily, in turn, would respond with drunken accusations about Stalin's responsibility for his mother's death and the destruction of their family. These confrontations became increasingly violent and unpredictable. Witnesses reported incidents where Stalin would physically assault Vasily during their arguments, and occasions when Vasily would threaten his father with weapons before being subdued by bodyguards. The dynamic had become more like that of enemies than family members. Svetlana, meanwhile, was walking an increasingly dangerous tightrope. She had to maintain the appearance of loyalty and compliance while secretly harboring growing hatred for her father and everything he represented. She had learned to hide her true thoughts and feelings behind a mask of dutiful daughter, but the strain was becoming unbearable. Stalin's suspicions about Svetlana were more subtle, but equally dangerous. He had begun to question her loyalty, monitor her correspondence more closely, and restrict her movements under the guise of protection. He sensed that she was keeping secrets from him, and in Stalin's world, secrets were tantamount to treason. The paranoia extended to Stalin's treatment of his grandchildren, Vasily's children, and Svetlana's offspring from her arranged marriage. Stalin viewed them with the same suspicious scrutiny that he applied to everyone else, seeing potential threats or tools for manipulation rather than innocent children deserving of love and protection. During this period, Stalin also became increasingly obsessed with his legacy and how history would judge him. He spent hours reviewing documents, rewriting official histories, and planning monuments to himself. But he was also acutely aware that his children represented potential threats to his carefully constructed mythology. Yakov's death in German captivity had been successfully spun as heroic sacrifice, but Vasily's alcoholism and Svetlana's growing independence posed ongoing threats to Stalin's image as the perfect Soviet father and leader. He began to consider more drastic measures to control or eliminate these liabilities. The final confrontation came in early 1953, just months before Stalin's death. Vasily, in a moment of drunken honesty, accused his father of being a murderer who had destroyed everything he touched, including his own family. Stalin's response was to order Vasily's immediate arrest and imprisonment. But before this could be carried out, Stalin suffered the stroke that would kill him within days. As Stalin lay dying in March 1953, surrounded by fearful subordinates and sycophantic doctors, his children were notably absent. Vasily was too drunk to be summoned, and Svetlana was kept away by party officials who didn't trust her emotional state or her potential reactions to her father's death. The man who had ruled over 200 million people died essentially alone, abandoned by the family he had systematically destroyed through decades of manipulation, betrayal, and cruelty. Stalin's death in March 1953 didn't bring freedom to his children. It brought a different kind of imprisonment. They were no longer protected by their father's power, but they were still marked by his crimes. The Soviet establishment viewed them with suspicion and fear, uncertain whether they might try to claim their father's legacy or seek revenge for his treatment of them. The new leadership faced a delicate problem: what to do with Stalin's surviving children. Keeping them close risked creating focal points for Stalin loyalists who might oppose the new regime's policies. But eliminating them entirely would be too obvious and might create martyrs. The solution was a careful campaign of marginalization and control. Vasily's fate was sealed within months of his father's death. Already discredited by years of alcoholism and erratic behavior, he presented the easiest target for the new leadership. In April 1953, barely a month after Stalin's death, Vasily was arrested on charges of anti-Soviet agitation and abuse of power. The charges were largely fabricated, cobbled together from years of complaints about Vasily's behavior and his drunken outbursts against party officials. But they served their purpose, removing a potentially embarrassing reminder of Stalin's personal failures and sending a clear message that Stalin's children would receive no special protection. Vasily's arrest was conducted with deliberate humiliation. He was taken from his apartment in the middle of the night, still drunk and barely conscious. The man who had once commanded fighter squadrons and been celebrated as a war hero was dragged away like a common criminal, his military decorations stripped away and his reputation destroyed. The trial was a foregone conclusion, conducted in secret with predetermined outcomes. Vasily was sentenced to 8 years of imprisonment and internal exile, to be followed by permanent banishment from Moscow and other major cities. He would spend the next 8 years in various prisons and labor camps, forgotten by the regime that had once celebrated him. Prison life was particularly brutal for Vasily because of his identity. Other inmates viewed him with suspicion and hostility. He was simultaneously a symbol of the regime they hated and a victim of that same regime's cruelty. Guards alternated between showing him deference due to his former status and subjecting him to extra harassment because of his father's crimes. Vasili's health, already compromised by decades of heavy drinking, deteriorated rapidly in prison. He developed severe liver problems, heart disease, and what would now be recognized as clinical depression. The man who had once been physically robust and charismatic became a shadow of his former self. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Vasili's imprisonment was how completely he was forgotten by Soviet society. The same media that had once celebrated his military achievements now ignored his existence entirely. His former colleagues and subordinates were forbidden from mentioning his name or acknowledging their past relationships with him. When Vasily was finally released in 1960, he was a broken man. The Soviet Union had moved on from Stalin's era, and there was no place for Stalin's son in the new order. He was given a small pension and a modest apartment in Kazan, far from Moscow and the centers of power where he had once moved freely. Vasily spent his final years in obscurity, struggling with continued alcoholism and the psychological damage of his imprisonment. He made several attempts to rehabilitate his reputation and return to Moscow, but these efforts were consistently blocked by authorities who wanted him to remain invisible. He died on March 19, 1962, at the age of 40, his body ravaged by alcohol and his spirit broken by years of imprisonment and exile. The man who had once been groomed as Stalin's heir died alone and forgotten, just another casualty of the system his father had created. His death barely registered in Soviet media, mentioned only in brief obituaries that identified him simply as a former military officer. There was no mention of his relationship to Stalin, no acknowledgement of his wartime service, and no recognition of the tragedy his life had become. He was buried in a modest grave with only a handful of people in attendance. The contrast between Vasili's death and his earlier life was stark and deliberate. The regime wanted to erase any memory of Stalin's family, to make it clear that the Stalin era was over and that no remnants of his legacy would be tolerated. Throughout this entire saga, there was another member of Stalin's family whose story has been largely forgotten: Konstantin Kuzakov, Stalin's illegitimate son born during his Siberian exile. Konstantin's existence was acknowledged by Stalin but never publicly revealed, making him perhaps the luckiest of all Stalin's children. Born in 1911 to Maria Kuzakova, Konstantin was raised in obscurity while his father rose to power. Stalin provided financial support and ensured Konstantin received a good education, but he was never brought into the inner circle of power that destroyed his half-siblings. Konstantin became a successful television journalist and lived a relatively normal life by Soviet standards. He married, had children, and pursued his career without the burden of being publicly identified as Stalin's son. His anonymity was his salvation. The contrast between Konstantin's fate and that of his siblings is striking. While Yakov died abandoned in a Nazi prison camp, Vasily drank himself to death, and Svetlana fled into exile, Konstantin lived quietly and died peacefully in 1996, having outlived the Soviet Union itself. His story suggests that perhaps the greatest gift Stalin could give his children was indifference, that neglect was preferable to the toxic attention he showered on his acknowledged offspring. The stories of Stalin's children aren't just personal tragedies. They're a microcosm of the broader horror that was Stalinist Russia. Every technique of control, manipulation, and terror that Stalin used against his own people was first tested on his own family. He abandoned Yakov to prove his loyalty to the state, knowing that this abandonment would result in his son's death. He corrupted Vasily with privilege and then destroyed him when that corruption became inconvenient. He imprisoned Svetlana with love and surveillance, turning affection into a weapon of control. The pattern was always the same. Stalin would create dependency, then exploit that dependency for his own purposes. His children needed his approval, his protection, his love, and he used those needs to manipulate and ultimately destroy them. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Stalin's treatment of his children was how systematic it was. This wasn't the result of mental illness or emotional instability. It was the calculated application of power for its own sake. Stalin destroyed his children because he could, because their destruction served his purposes, and because he viewed their suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining his authority. The tragedy extends beyond Stalin's immediate family. His treatment of his children sent a clear message to everyone in the Soviet Union. If Stalin could destroy his own flesh and blood without hesitation, then no one was safe. The family became a symbol of the state's power over the individual, proof that personal relationships were subordinate to political necessity. Svetlana's defection in 1967 was more than just a personal escape. It was a rejection of everything her father had represented. Her decision to seek asylum in the United States was the ultimate repudiation of Stalin's legacy, a daughter's final judgment on her father's crimes. The journey to freedom wasn't easy. Svetlana had to abandon her 2 children from her previous marriages, knowing that taking them with her would be impossible, and that staying would mean continued imprisonment in her father's shadow. In America, Svetlana tried to build a new life, writing memoirs that revealed intimate details about Stalin's personal life and the inner workings of the Soviet system. Her books became bestsellers, but they also made her a target for Soviet intelligence services and a curiosity for Western media. The woman who had once been Stalin's beloved daughter found herself alone in a foreign country, famous but isolated, free but haunted by the knowledge of what her freedom had cost. She changed her name to Lana Peters, married an American architect, and tried to disappear into ordinary life. But escape from Stalin's legacy proved impossible. Her past followed her everywhere, making normal relationships difficult and peace of mind elusive. She struggled with depression and anxiety, the psychological scars of her childhood manifesting in various ways throughout her adult life. Svetlana's later years were marked by restlessness and searching. She returned briefly to the Soviet Union in 1984, hoping to reconnect with her children, but found that too much had changed. She came back to America, then moved to England, always searching for a place where she could simply be herself rather than Stalin's daughter. She died in 2011 in Wisconsin, having outlived the Soviet Union by 20 years. Her death marked the end of Stalin's direct bloodline and closed a chapter in one of history's most tragic family stories. The story of Stalin's children is ultimately a story about the corruption of power and the destruction of the human spirit. Joseph Stalin, who claimed to be building a better world for all of humanity, couldn't even protect his own children from the monster he had become. Yakov died abandoned and alone, betrayed by the father who should have moved heaven and earth to save him. Vasily destroyed himself with alcohol, trying to numb the pain of watching his father become a mass murderer. Svetlana spent her entire life trying to escape a legacy of blood and terror that followed her to the grave. Their stories remind us that evil doesn't exist in a vacuum. It spreads outward from its source, destroying everything it touches, including the bonds of family that should be sacred and unbreakable. Stalin's children were among his first victims, and their suffering foreshadowed the suffering he would inflict on millions of others. In the end, the man who once bent an empire to his will, who oversaw the forced industrialization of a vast nation, orchestrated the starvation of millions, and ruled with a paranoia so consuming that even his closest allies fell under suspicion, died alone. Joseph Stalin, a figure who inspired both worship and terror, passed away without the comfort of his children, without a word of affection from those whose lives were most entwined with his own. The silence at his deathbed echoed a deeper, more profound truth, that for all his power, he had become a stranger to his own family, feared, resented, and ultimately left behind. It was, perhaps, the only end possible for a man who had systematically dismantled the human bonds that tether us to one another. In choosing dominance over empathy, suspicion over trust, and ideology over intimacy, Stalin not only destroyed millions of lives, he poisoned the fragile ties of love within his own home. He demanded loyalty, but offered none in return. He expected obedience from his children, yet treated them as pawns in his paranoid empire. What remained were fractured souls, burdened by a name they neither chose nor escaped. The tragedy of Stalin's children is not just a biographical footnote to a dictator's life. It is a lens into the personal toll of totalitarianism. Each child, in their own way, became collateral damage in a regime built on fear and control. One died in captivity, sacrificed on the altar of political calculation. Another succumbed to addiction, consumed by the weight of shame and internal conflict. One fled across continents in search of a life unshadowed by a name that had become a symbol of cruelty. None of them were free, not truly, for the shadow of their father darkened every relationship, every decision, every attempt at independence. But beyond the personal loss, their stories also raise uncomfortable questions about identity, inheritance, and responsibility. What does it mean to be the child of a tyrant? Can guilt be passed down through blood? Or is it imposed by the expectations of a society desperate to make sense of unfathomable suffering? Stalin's children lived at the intersection of victimhood and privilege, bearing both the scars of emotional abandonment and the suspicion of a world that saw them as extensions of a monster. They were both shielded and condemned by history, at once too close to power and never far enough away to escape its reach. Yet despite the immense weight of their legacy, the lives of Stalin's children offer something more than sorrow. They offer testimony. In exile, in interviews, in private writings, and public silences, they became reluctant witnesses to a history many tried to deny or forget. Their survival, and in some cases their refusal to remain silent, stands as a quiet act of resistance, not against their father, perhaps, but against the erasure he tried so hard to enforce. In the ruins of personal loss, they carried forward the one thing Stalin's regime could never fully control: memory. Their stories are a mirror reflecting the ultimate futility of tyranny. Even the most powerful system of control, backed by armies, prisons, propaganda, and terror, cannot engineer love, cannot compel genuine loyalty, cannot erase the human need for connection. Stalin ruled with absolute power, but he could not make his children love him. He could command a nation, but not the hearts of those who shared his blood. And so, in the strange calculus of history, it is through them, through the children he tried to mold or abandon, that Stalin is most humanly judged, not through statues or state archives, but through the emotional wreckage left behind, their pain, their choices, their longing to escape or confront his legacy, all speak to a deeper truth. That tyranny, for all its outward strength, is built on a foundation of fear so brittle it collapses in the absence of love. Stalin's children paid a terrible price, not for their own sins, but for their father's. Yet in death, they achieved something denied to them in life. They became witnesses, not just to the man, but to the myth, not just to the cruelty of the past, but to the enduring necessity of remembering it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.